Hello, good morning, friends. I find myself quite at ease today and happy to call all of you friends. We are together for 3 days in a row now, deliberating on literature in times like these. Well, it's not a mere observance of protocol when I thank Principal in Charge, Dr. Varalakshmi, for her encouragement and support to this endeavor, because she's a literary minded person, as I told you, and her blessings and good wishes on this occasion we really cherish. I also thank my colleagues at the Department of English, Queen Mary's College, for all their love and support and comradeship. And I welcome them on this occasion. I welcome all of you, dear participants. It's good to see your names popping up in the chat box. And I'm getting familiar with many names of people all across Tamil Nadu and India. And so good to see that you are participating with so much enthusiasm. It has become customary in our lecture series to share a snippet about the history of Queen Mary's College. So for today, I have an anecdote for you. And these little anecdotes are like starters before the actual lavish meal that our resource person is going to give us. And the story that I have for you today is a great appetizer, I can say. So this is the story of Mrs. Nallamuthu Ramamurthy, the first Indian principal of Queen Mary's College. And this anecdote is narrated in Monica Felton's book, A Child Widow's Story. So this book, A Child Widow's Story, is actually about Sister Subbulakshmi. Many of you might know about Sister Subbulakshmi, who was a child widow who tenaciously empowered herself through education and helped in founding the Widows' Home, which was originally located in Egmore, and called Sarada Illam. And later this Sarada Illam came to what we know as Vivekananda House now. In the olden days, it was called Ice House, and this building is adjacent to Queen Mary's College. So in that book, Monica Felton devotes 2 pages to the story of Nallamuthu Ramamurthy, and now I quote from this book. But before I proceed, I also want to say that the 3 child widows who came to study in Queen Mary's came from Sarada Illam. Their names were Amukutti, Lakshmi, and Parvati. So over to this quote from Monica Felton's book. Yeah. This happened at the PT school where Sister Subbalakshmi taught. Just after that, she got a government job and left. And after this, the girls in the sixth form of the PT school were asked to write essays about what they thought should be the next step forward in the education of Indian girls and women. Nalamuthu Ramamurthy wanted a women's college in Madras. Her essay won a prize. She was invited to read it in the presence of a member of the governor's executive council who came one day to visit the school. A very bold and interesting suggestion, the visitor commended. But the expense of starting a college for ladies would be very great. And I doubt very much that there are enough students to justify the outlay. There were murmurs of dissent. The visitor asked, will those girls who are leaving school this summer and who wish to spend the next 3 or 4 years working for a degree please raise their hands? The 17 girls in Nalamuthu's class all raised their hands. I have never been able to find out, Mrs. Nalamuthu Ramamurthy said to Monica Pelton, of course, whether at that time the government had already decided to open a women's college or whether it was the enthusiasm we showed that influenced them to make the decision to start a college. In the summer of 1914, just before the World War broke out, Queen Mary's College was opened, and I and most of the girls in my class joined it. Unquote. So, this is a testament to the power of words, the power of a piece of writing to shape the course of history. Who knows if our little endeavor, literature in times like these, could be scripting history in some small way. The essay of a sixth form student might have been the germ of an idea for a college for women. And though Nalamuthu is very guarded in not making claims that it was her essay alone which triggered this initiative, definitely her essay played a role in bringing into existence what was then known as the Madras College for Women, and eventually down the line came to be known as Queen Mary's College for Women. Little did Nalamuthu know at that point in time that she would later join Queen Mary's College as a member of faculty and, even further down the line, become the first Indian principal of the college. So, on that uplifting note, we move to engaging with the theme of today's lecture. I would like to introduce to you our speaker of the day, Dr. Ganesh, who's a retired professor and head of the Department of English, Madras Christian College, and he's currently with the Department of English, University of Madras. He has graciously consented to speak today on transcendentalism in relation to our theme. Dr. Ganesh joined the Department of English, Madras Christian College in June 1986 and continued to serve the department till he retired in 2019. With a passion for literature inculcated by his amazing teachers in Madras Christian College, he taught 3 generations of students. His doctoral research was on metadrama in both Oriental and Occidental traditions, and his research and teaching interests are theaters of the world, film studies, ecology literature and development, English studies in India, and India studies and Shakespeare in diverse contexts. He became the head of the Department of English in 2014 and had the proud privilege of serving the department in that capacity for 5 years. So many of you know Dr. Ganesh, and actually this introduction was not needed. I'm so grateful to you, sir, for making the time for us in the midst of your busy schedule. You're much sought after speaker and webinars. So thank you for making time to speak to us today. We're so grateful to you, sir. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Uh, Good morning, all, and good morning, all my friends who are there part of this webinar. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Maria Preeti for this amazing opportunity to connect with people and the great opportunity to get in touch with past students, present students, friends. And I'm very happy that she suggested this topic to me. Literature of transcendence, but obviously to be seen in the light of our present day circumstances. So thank you, Dr. Maria Preeti and the teaching fraternity of Queen Mary's for this amazing opportunity. Now, I would like to define transcendence from a different perspective, because we normally get to think that transcendence means otherworldly concepts. So when you focus on this particular topic of literature and transcendence in the given circumstance, I think transcendence will have to take a different resonance altogether. Next slide, please. Now, the focus of this webinar is to look at literature and transcendence from the point of view of what transcendence means. I use the word fresh perspective. It's not really fresh, but in the sense that normally there is a rather misconception, I would say, that transcendence means otherworld. So for me, transcendence doesn't mean otherworldly concerns, but it definitely signals a state of consciousness, right? In the context of our own living, where we need to live with each other with boundless compassion and a supreme understanding. Now, when you go back, let's say, to the English Romanticism and American Transcendentalism, which were almost parallel movements, because Emerson met Wordsworth and Coleridge when he was on his European tour. And obviously, they had a kind of a mutual contact. So I will use the writers from English Romanticism and American Transcendentalism as frames of reference. So obviously, this idea of transcendence is related to, as I told you, going out of oneself and release oneself from the bonds of one's own egoism, and then try to embrace the whole world with that supreme understanding that we are all connected, not technologically, but emotionally and spiritually. Next slide, please. When you look at the word transcendence itself, transcendence, when you look at the etymology of the word transcendence means, let's say, go beyond or climb beyond, right? It comes from the word trans, which means beyond, and scandere, which means to climb. Now, when you achieve transcendence, you are expected to go beyond your ordinary limitations. And more importantly, you are supposed to be in a spiritual state, which normally we think is unconnected to this world, that it's a private experience, that you are in a state of bliss. We are not denying all that. But we are looking at the word transcendence today as the joy of connecting and the meaning of connecting. Now, I would like to begin with a very important quote from Charlie Chaplin in a movie called The Great Dictator, which was made in 1940. I'd imagine that the World War is happening, and this was a movie which was supposed to be a spoof on Hitler. There is an amazing speech towards the end of the movie, when he says, we think too much, we feel too little. And you know that the literature of transcendence and other literatures that followed 18th century Enlightenment have always condemned this idea of reasoning too much. Right? When romantics return to the world of reason, return to the world of emotion, return to the world of feeling, right? They were obviously going against the Enlightenment, say, kind of plan to rely completely on reason. And obviously, Charlie Chaplin, one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, very clearly said, let's say that we need to feel more and think, let's say, a little less, primarily because thinking has led to a lot of chaos. And he continues, we need humanity more than cleverness. We need kindness more than, so we need kindness and gentleness more than cleverness. And life obviously will become violent and all will be lost. Now, this is almost a kind of an apocalyptic prediction that comes from that particular movie. And connected to this, you have a very significant statement made by one of the greatest scientists, let's say, of not only of the 20th century, but one of the greatest scientists in the world. He talked about two very important concepts. He spoke about the idea of universe and multiverse. And he spoke about separateness or being unconnected as a kind of a problem. Now, we use the word universe, but more often than not, we experience only multiverse. By multiverse, we mean we see a lot of difference. We see a lot of unconnectedness, as it were. And then he very clearly says that if you feel and think that you are separated from the rest, and he uses an amazing expression, he says it is an optical delusion of consciousness. And that optical delusion of consciousness, which completely, say, beclouds our mind, right, doesn't make us think properly, feel properly, becomes a prison. And it restricts us primarily because we are bound to our own ego. Right? That you only think about people who are close to you, affection for few persons, as he rightly says. But then, what is transcendence? How do we move from this multiverse to universe conceptually? Right? Multiverse we see, obviously, but universe is an ideal. The experience of universe is an ideal. And how do you achieve that? And this comes from a scientist, right? This comes from a quantum physicist who makes a clear statement that unless you widen your circle of compassion and embrace all living creatures, the whole of nature in its beauty. Right? If you had not, say, found out that it's Albert Einstein, we would think it's a statement made by one of the deep ecologists of the present day. But in a letter, let's say to his friend Madras, he makes this particular statement. And to me, let's say, the literature of transcendence must have that potential to rectify this optical delusion of consciousness. Whether it is American transcendentalism or English romanticism, or the traditions that have, say, followed them, that the other traditions that have flown, let's say, taking inspiration from them. The basic purpose of literature is to, say, release us from this delusion of consciousness. And that means human consciousness is very, very important in this particular context. Right? Though we deny, let's say, or denounce anthropocentrism, we shouldn't forget the fact that if the world were to be made into a better place, it is human consciousness alone that will be able to effect that magical change. So then we are looking for literature, whether it's ancient or, say, medieval or contemporary, literature that can rectify the optical delusion of consciousness. Next slide, please. Now, as you argued earlier, we speak about the perspective, let's say the perspective. Now, when you say nature poetry, when you say transcendental poetry, right, you read Emerson, you read Thoreau, you read Whitman, you read Emily Dickinson, later you read Melville, right, or Wordsworth and his company. We normally think that they fly away from this world and into a world of imagination and so on. But what is more important is literature of transcendence in the present circumstance should never be a literature of escapism. I'm not saying their literatures are literatures of escapism, but we generally tend to believe that this world is a problematic world. The world wherein has fever and the fret of this universe. Right? Where to think is to be full of sorrow, as Keats says. So literature of transcendence must never be a literature of escapism, where you find your own solutions, you find, let's say, your own spiritual bliss. But literature of transcendence must be a literature of proaction. And when does proaction take place? Proaction takes place when discourse and praxis come together. Right? When discourse and praxis come together. Because if they are divided, then ultimately theory remains theory, and say the practical life is unconnected with theory. So we need theories that are too relevant, let's say, for our own practical concerns. Right? We don't need theories, let's say, which say disconnect us from our immediate circumstances of life. So what we need is, as I told you, this meaningful interface between discourse and praxis. And then, as students of literature, we need this immediate connection between literary studies and environmental activism. Again, the moment we use the word environment, we should not think that it's only the world of nature. It obviously includes the world of nature, but the word environmental will obviously comprise, say, our own surroundings. As Lawrence brilliantly said, the concern of literature is to deal with the relationship between an individual and his or her circumambient universe. So the word environmental activism will obviously include that Wordsworthian sentiment to listen to the still, sad music of humanity. So this connection is absolutely important, that literary studies and environmental activism should come together at this particular point. And the moment you say activism, you go back to the word proaction. Right? You go back to the word proaction. Then we have certain conceptual terms. I'm not going through the entire passage. We connect, let's say, with the basic topic about transcendence, biocentrism, and say ecocentrism, as we use those terms. Right? Now, what is more important? It's a moral claim about the intrinsic value of the natural world. Right? If you are biocentric, you are interested in the intrinsic value of the natural world. But if you move to ecocentrism, we believe that there is intrinsic value in everything and everyone around us. Right? So ecocentrism is a takeoff on biocentrism. Biocentrism will belong to the natural world. Ecocentrism will include the world of nature, but obviously rope in humanity also. And then it's in that connection that we look for what is called an authentic selfhood. So what is required today is an authentic selfhood, right? Which is self. Again, the next part of the speech, I will deal with what self is and how does one define self, right? Authentic selfhood, right? Now, that authentic selfhood is against any centrism. Right? We know in theory, feminism came as an antidote to androcentrism. Eco-criticism came as an antidote to anthropocentrism. And post-colonial criticism came as an antidote to Eurocentrism. So we don't need centrisms at this time. And for me, ecocentric living is a very, very important mode of living. And an expression of that ecocentric consciousness will obviously comprise the literature of transcendence. And we'll see how these writers have already anticipated this movement. Though Wordsworth and Coleridge were not as proactive as, say, Emerson and Thoreau were, still they did talk about things that matter to us or matter to us even now. So we need to obviously be alive to the apocalyptic threats. But what is most important is, as I told you, explore an authentic selfhood, which happens, going back to what Einstein said, only when you widen your circle of compassion. Right? The word selfhood is a bit of a problem in this particular context if you connect it to a kind of ego or egotism or egoism, as we call it. So then, literature of transcendence will obviously have the political dimension as a very, very important dimension. And going back, let's say, to the same idea from Pramod Nayar, he makes a very significant statement. We are students of literature. And we read texts, including the world, going back to Derrida, world itself is a text. So in that context, we read texts and we need to have a specific practice of reading. And that practice of reading should make us alive to what he calls social inequalities, gender oppression, environmental exploitation. And he also makes the same statement that there must be a meaningful connect between theory and praxis. Right? In other words, this activist framework becomes extremely important. Right? So giving value to species, to ecosystems, to Earth as a whole, now that would be transforming what is called theory into practice. Now, eco-criticism, or as we deal with deep ecology more, let's say in this discussion, say is significant primarily because theory emanates out of practice. Right? How they lived, how people live, great eco-philosophers, they all lived their lives so meaningfully, like Thoreau or Emerson or Wordsworth or Coleridge. You understand that you theorize from their life. So theory in that sense, obviously, is that which comes from praxis. It's a beautiful blend, again, say, between theory and practice. So when you say that you make, let's say, you effect this transformation from mere theory into praxis, and then indulge in what is called, say, an activist framework. You locate reading in an activist framework. Now, how does one understand activism? Is it possible for us to, let's say, bring about great changes in life of the world, I mean? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Now, you can, in your own limited sphere of, say, time and space, act. So you can create ripples, but don't forget small ripples are actually waves. So activism doesn't mean, let's say, a collective group, let's say, going and trying to effect a change in society, which is very, very important. But I'm talking about our own individual, say, contribution to this idea of transforming theory into praxis. Next slide, please. Now, living in pandemic times, we need to understand ourselves very differently, right? What is self? What is transcendence? Obviously, it is an expansion of self. Because the moment we use the word self, it will connect only to ourselves, as we have already seen in the previous part. But selfishness obviously becomes a recipe for disaster. So transcendence then must obviously be an expansion of that self. Selfhood, authentic selfhood is an expansion, right? Is an expansion. And Arne, one of the high priests of deep ecology, asks this very meaningful question. Can you, let's say, limit self-realization and self-fulfillment to lifelong ego trips, he asks. Then you, in one sense, you take away the value and meaning of such a term called self-realization. Amazing word, say, amazing, expression. So when you use the word self-fulfillment or self-realization, is it tied to your own tiny ego? Are you cocooned in your own, let's say, personal, say, desires, or are you capable of expanding yourself to embrace the world, as we said earlier? So he very clearly says that widening and deepening yourself, you embrace all life forms. So Charlie Chaplin, Einstein, and Arne. Now see the connect, spiritual connect, emotional connect, intellectual connect. So they all speak about this very important idea of expansion and living in our own times, as we said earlier. What we need is this expansion. Selfishness at this point in time would obviously be a recipe for disaster. Whatever we can. However we can contribute, I think we must contribute. And then, let's say, what you see ultimately is the different trajectories of expansion from oneself, then to family, to community, to country, through the world to the planet. Right? Through the world to the planet. So how do we understand transcendence? We understand that transcendence is the realization of the scale and scope of what we call well-being. We talk about the scope and scale of well-being. So to me, then, transcendence is a celebration of diversity in all life forms. Right? All life forms. That's why I told you the word environment has a broad-based significance, including everything in this cosmos. So when you celebrate diversity, what is achieved is resilience and emotional resilience. Right? It's almost a spiritual forte quality that we have, because as, say, quantum physicists and deep ecologists of the present day have said constantly, life did not take over the planet by combat, but it has taken over this world by networking. So if the natural world has operated and sustained itself through networking, maybe the human world had rather negatively contributed through combat. So it's high time that we understand that we give up combat and move towards networking. Right? Give up combat and say move towards networking in our own sphere, again, as I told you. Now, when you celebrate diversity, celebration doesn't mean, say, the joy of say, talking about an emotional connect, but celebration also includes the keenness to understand every single voice, however subjugated it is, however marginalized it is. We live in a time that we have to listen to a whole lot of narratives, a whole lot of narratives coming from all, say, corners of a social setup or a community living. So we did not obviously say, conquer this world or get this world. Natural world will teach you that it's only through network, right? Not through combat. Next slide, please. Now, this leads to a very important idea of what is called a sustainable community. And these people, when Emerson wrote that essay, Nature, when Thoreau experienced nature, let's say living in Walden, when Wordsworth lost himself in the beauties of nature, or Keats obviously lost himself in the beauty of nature, one thing they understood is that nature has something to teach us. And that is nature's inherent ability to sustain life. And our job at this particular point is not to interfere with that sustaining force. That's one point. Number two, learn lessons. So this communion with nature should never be understood as a kind of silly sentimentality. Right? When Wordsworth, in a poem called Boating Expedition, would say that he did not wish to disturb the peace of a boat when it's happily dangling on the waters, we may think, what is he doing? But he was able to understand, he was able to, say, negotiate with nature very differently. Negotiate with nature very differently. Now, this leads us to another idea called ecoliteracy. Now, ecoliteracy is a sure means of transcendental knowledge. And what do you mean by being ecoliterate? You understand the organization of ecological communities. Right? You understand the knowledge of ecological community, the principles of organization, particularly of ecological community. And then, more importantly, use those principles in creating sustainable human communities. That's what you mean by nature is my teacher. What's what you said? Nature is my nurse, guide, guardian of my heart, and the soul of all my moral being. So we are not taken in by just the emotional fervor of these lines, but we understand the spiritual basis for these lines. Right? A spiritual basis for these lines. And the next part, when there are, say, many eco-philosophers, and one very important philosopher in present day times, is one Fritjof Capra, Dr. Fritjof Capra, a quantum physicist turned environmentalist. And I'll just take one expression from this particular quote, which is sustain the web of life. Sustain the web of life. Right? When you use that expression, web of life, we immediately understand that in the web of life, every single strand is important. Every single strand is absolutely significant. Right? You don't denounce, you don't decide who should live or what should live. Now, can we have that boundless compassion to embrace this world and allow things to be? Right? Martin Heidegger used that expression, let things be. Allow them as they are. You don't assign values to them. So ecological literacy is that supreme capacity to believe in this concept called the web of life. Right? The concept called the web of life. And our responsibility is to sustain that web of life. Very, very important that we need to sustain the web of life in the present circumstances. When you say, definitely listen to the still sad music of humanity in the context of our own present day pandemic crisis. So ecological literacy, deep ecological consciousness, earth-centeredness, which doesn't say exclude humanity at this particular point. Now this becomes what you will call the crux of the literature of transcendence. Right? They are the cornerstone. They are the bedrock, let's say, of what you call ecological, literature of transcendence. Next slide, please. Then we continue with Arne Naes, where he obviously spoke about a deep ecological, say, pledge. Previous slide, please. His deep ecological pledge is very significant here. Right? Earth first, he said, right? And what he wanted to address is the worldview. You know, literature throughout, say, the time frames that it has existed, has always obviously addressed a worldview. Without a worldview, there can be no literature. Either it's a collective worldview or an individual worldview, which can be subversive, and it can be protesting. A worldview is not merely an intellectual attitude, but it's an emotional response to this world. So worldview, thinking, responses, right? But don't forget, anthropocentrism is only against the centrism in the context of, say, humanity. But don't forget, without human consciousness, nothing is operable in this world. So what we need is to, say, build a safe planet, ensure a safe planet, not only for the biocentric world, which is important, but the ecocentric world, which, as I told you, definitely includes human beings. And the second one is very important. Every life form has a worth of its own. And this almost becomes a tenor of my argument, right? Independent of its usefulness. Right? Martin Heidegger obviously contributed to this particular thinking. We normally talk about two values. One is called instrumental value, the other is called intrinsic value. Instrumental value is human assigned values to things and people. Right? You need them, you don't need them. Hitler thought, let's say, Jews were unnecessary, communists were unnecessary, gypsies were unnecessary. So he assigned instrumental values to human beings and went on a mindless rampage against these people. Whereas when you believe in the intrinsic value of everything around you, every single human being, every single object that you come across in this world, you need to think independent of its usefulness. And obviously, we talk about diversity. We have talked about diversity. And I said transcendence is a celebration, recognition and celebration of diversity. And the last point, again, connecting to this, Life on earth is a value. Anything on the planet, let's say, is of value. And then you have an amazing poem from Emerson called the Rhodora. Right? It's a flower that he, say, brought to limelight, as it were. Right? Normally, when you say rose, lily, and other flowers dominate the literary scene, Emerson decided to bring Rhodora to the center in his poem. Right? Bring Rhodora to the center in his poem. He showcased not its usefulness, but he showcased its intrinsic value. And the poem goes like this. Say, people ask, he says, why, Rhodora, you are so beautiful? Why are you blooming in some nook and corner? Right? What is your use? What's the purpose of your existence? And then, say, Emerson concludes the poem by saying, but in my simple ignorance, suppose the self-same power that brought me there brought you. That's how he addresses Rhodora. The self-same power that brought me there brought you. Which is one of the essential features of transcendentalism, looking for divine spark in everything around us. There is divinity. Not only a divinity that shapes our ends, as Hamlet would say, but there is intrinsic divinity in every single thing. And Emerson recognized that through, let's say, just a kind of an analysis of the existence of a particular flower called Rhodora. Right? He has made it famous, that's fine, but what he has done is to give it a center. Right? To give it a center. So Rhodora is a very significant, say, poem having transcendental resonances, because in one sense, it stands for all that is subjugated, all that is marginalized, and all that is valued instrumentally, not intrinsically. So you see the deep ecological connect, let's say in the context of Emerson, when he wrote this particular poem. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture I like primarily because through a picture, it's able to tell us how we live. Right? When you take the first picture, the man is on top, woman below. Obviously, you have the idea of patriarchy in operation. So the first picture is hierarchic, exploitative, and power-centered. The second picture is obviously non-hierarchic and non-exploitative. Right? There's a beautiful coexistence, peaceful coexistence as we use that particular term, though that particular term is only used, not realized. That's why we said practice is important. Practice is important in whichever sphere you are in, as I told you. So nature actually tells us that we are all connected in what is called the web of life. Man, woman, fish, everything, right? Everything is connected. The natural world, the whole cosmic world, the planets. So what we need is a very significant perception. So if ego, as we have said, is a recipe for disaster, this conception of nature, which talks about this web of relationship, everything is related to everything else. In a novel, actually, Lawrence said, but he believed that it is true in life also. Right? Meaningful relationship with our circumambient universe, Lawrencean ideal. So this picture is important. And today we discuss in eco-literature and in transcendental literature, because for me, eco-literature is transcendental literature, that we move from what is called leadership to stewardship. In the ego frame, it is leadership. We are in command, we are in control. That will lead to a very important concept called Anthropocene, which I will discuss soon. Right? So this picture provides us with a knowledge of how things are actually and what we have made of that. Right? We have created a world out of what nature has actually created. And this obviously is a kind of a terrible creation when you look at it. Next slide, please. Now we go to this idea of Anthropocene. The previous one, sir. Anthropocene, where we discuss in the previous one, sir. The previous one. Yeah, next, previous one. Previous. The previous one. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Now, what is Anthropocene? How do you look at Anthropocene? It refers to the current geological age, right? Viewed as a period during which the human activity has been a dominant influence on climate and environment. Right? A geoscientist, Ashok Singhvi, makes a statement. What took nature to, say, achieve or do in billions of years, he says, human beings have done it in last decades. Right? We have caused destruction very soon. We have not, in one sense, adjusted ourselves to the amazing natural process. And when you look at, say, Anthropocene, which comes from geology, right? It's a term connected with geology, providing you with the history of this earth. We also understand at the same time that Anthropocene is not a geological concern alone, but a geopolitical one. Because we said that the political dimension in the literature of transcendence must occupy a primary position. And the next point, let's say, which talks about carbon emissions and all that we have caused to this particular world. Right? We have done this, let's say, from the time of industrialization with which English Romanticism is connected, American Transcendentalism is connected. We have defiled Earth. We have defiled the world of nature. And that is described as what is called the human impact, a debilitating human impact on the world of nature, which is called Anthropocene, where mass migrations of fauna and, say, of huge extinctions of biodiversity and other changes. But don't forget, let's say today, in our own context, the word mass migrations will have painful resonances. We have seen in our own country, huge problem faced by migrants, right? So in that particular context, the human contact, the human element in, say, terrible changes in this world must obviously be addressed by the literature of transcendence. It has to be rectified. It has to be put an end to. So Rekha Dixit's argument is, let's say, that we have done it, and then she says that we need to understand this human impact. Don't forget, I argued earlier that without human consciousness, nothing can happen, right? Without human consciousness, no great change can happen. But at the same time, human impact has been terrible. So human consciousness has to address this issue, right? Address this particular issue, right? In the immediate, say, circumstances of your life. Next slide, please. Emerson, again, in a very important poem called Hemathreya, makes a significant study of human desires to occupy land. When people, say, in the first years of American occupation, as it were, try to accumulate as much as possible. And then, obviously, Emerson made a statement, I and mine constitutes ignorance. Right? I and mine constitutes ignorance. We called it the recipe for disaster. Right? So the previous lines read like this, mine and yours, mine not yours, earth endures. Stars abide, shine down in the old sea. Old are the shores, but where are old men? I who have seen much, such I have never seen. Right? This is the previous stanza. Right? It's a meditation on human avarice. And then he concludes the poem by saying, Earth song, Earth speaks, let's say, to humanity. They called me theirs, whoso controlled me, yet everyone wished to stay and is gone. How am I theirs? If they cannot hold me, but I hold them. And then there is an amazing epiphany, say, in the end of the poem, when Emerson says, when I listened to the Earth song, when I heard the Earth song, I was no longer brave. Brave here refers to avariciousness, right? Courageous enough to exploit. My avarice cooled like lust in the chill of the grave. Amazing lines. And don't forget, for Emerson, it is an experience. He firmly believed that religion and spirituality are not concepts. He believed that religion is an experience. He believed that spirituality must become or must be an experience. So my avarice cooled like lust in the chill of the grave. Then we go to his colleague, his younger colleague. It was actually Emerson who gave him that piece of land for him to construct a small cabin and experience the world of nature. Thoreau makes a statement in Walden: the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. Right? Talking about the wide majority of the population. And what is called resignation is confirmed desperation. Resilience is different from resignation. Resignation obviously will be a passive resignation, accepting the status quo, as we call it. So he very clearly said that resignation, if you call it resignation, don't forget it is desperation. You cannot do something. And then he says, all men want not something to do with, but something to do. Because he was, in one sense, anti-technology, primarily because he believed that technology can assist humanity, but technology cannot dominate humanity. So he said, all men want not something to do with, but something to do, or rather something to be. Very important idea. Right? The word be, being, as it has been discussed in the first lecture. Right? The idea of being, and Anthropocene was discussed in Dr. Abdul's lecture. So the idea is this, let's say that we talk about that we need to experience a sense of being, which is authentic and an expansive selfhood, as we have argued earlier. But there has to be a spirit of revolt. And that spirit of revolt is what is called a revolt against our own conditioning. Later on, we will quickly see a few points. And then he was imprisoned for not paying poll tax. He was against the president of that time who actually, preferred slavery. He endorsed slavery. And he waged a war against, Mexico. So Thoreau was very upset with the establishment at that particular time. And on a day when he went to, mend his shoes, he was arrested and put in jail. And Emerson visited him and then asked him this question, Henry, why are you here? To which Thoreau very significantly replied, under a government which imprisons us any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. And he also asked the question, Mr. Emerson, why are you not here? Right? Not that he contested Emerson's activism, but it's a kind of a question that he asked that all just people who question centrisms, who question hierarchy, who question power centers, do something, let's say in their own way, will obviously be imprisoned by a particular system. Later on, Foucault and others have talked about this. Next slide, please. Now we deal with the connection between the idea of Anthropocene and the Romantics. Right? Nature poetry vis-a-vis romantic poetry. I just will refer to these 2 points. Composed upon Westminster Bridge, September 3, 1802, which actually, let's say, unconsciously deals with the idea of Anthropocene, the human impact. Right? The city of London is beautiful as nature is, primarily because human beings haven't woken up. Right? They have not woken up from their both literal slumber and metaphorical slumber. So the city looks beautiful. This city now does like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Words like this. Right? And all of them are quiet. Human beings haven't got up. So the place looks wonderful. Right? There is almost a great appreciation from a nature poet to appreciate the city of London. It's a very unique experience. He had it in July and he composed this poem in September. Recollected in tranquility. So in that context, composed upon Westminster Bridge, say, unconsciously deals with this idea of anthropocentrism, Anthropocene, right? Anthropocene. And the world is too much with us is definitely anti-industrial, anti-commercial, right? The world is too much with us, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little do we see in nature that is others. So these 2 points very clearly deal with humanity and what human beings have done to the present circumstances. So today, environmental poetry will focus more on the negative effects of human activity on the planet. Because nature poetry, the moment you say nature poetry, we have always say, listen to those amazing, epiphanic, revelatory, blissful moments of poets when they were in holy communion with nature. But today, environmental poetry will also focus on the effects of human activity on the planet. We are not going to say nature doesn't impact us pleasantly. No, we can never make that statement. Nature is nature. Nature is amazingly wonderful. But what is more important is a complicated connection between people and nature, right? Often written by poets who are concerned about the impact of the natural world, right? And then today we question, including Byron questioned, let's say, the conservatism of Wordsworth. Nature is no longer a rustic retreat of the Wordsworthian poet. In the given circumstance, let's say we understand that say Wordsworth may not be so favored as Emerson is or Thoreau is when you look at it from an ecological perspective, right? It is now a pressing political question. By nature, we include humanity also because it deals with a question of survival. And then, obviously, Peter Madson's famous statement, deep ecology is philosophical because it comprises metaphysics, epistemology, and social justice. Right? Epistemology is a means by which we understand. Right? Normally in philosophy, we say metaphysics, epistemology, and applied philosophy. Metaphysics is our grand conception of this universe. Epistemology is the means by which we understand that concept. But what is more important is applied philosophy. Truth, beauty, and goodness are not values conceptually alone, but they must be made manifest in every one of our activities. So what is more important is this link among metaphysics, epistemology, and social justice. Next slide, please. Now, romantic literature is extremely important, primarily because of its democratic commitment. Right? Very important. It is transcendental in that sense. I will deal with a few lines later, but I'll just mention these poems now. Little Black Boy, an amazing poem by William Blake. And don't forget, he wrote this poem when slavery was legal. Right? He wrote this poem when slavery was legal. Right? An amazing meditation on construct, social construct, political construct, demeaning social constructs for the white-skinned and the black-skinned. Elegy written in a country churchyard will tell us that everyone matters. Right? Every single human being matters. Leech Gatherer by Wordsworth again, Resolution or Independence, very clearly will say that a common human's life, when looked at from a different perspective, a unique perspective, is completely different. In other words, the common is actually uncommon. The ordinary is actually extraordinary. Leech Gatherer, a Wordsworthian poem, will deal with this particular issue, and so are the Lucy poems. The Old Cumberland Beggar, right? Michael, right? The Reverie of Poor Susan, which I will analyze later. All these poems very clearly drag the margins to the center. Like Emerson did to Rhodora, a Old Cumberland Beggar, Lucy, right? You know, the amazing commitment that he had to these common people. Though we question it today from the point of view of activism, right? You take the poems, she dwelt among the untrodden ways. A violet by a mossy stone, half hidden to the eye, but fair as a star, and only one is shining in the sky for him. For the world, she may be a violet by a mossy stone. And he says her death has created a different strain. Oh, difference, he says. It's a difference to me. And then there is another important poem of Wordsworth called The Tables Turn, in which he questions, very interestingly, in a mild Derridian sense, knowledge and civilization. Up, my friend, quit your books, he says. They obviously wanted to go into the world of nature. Like Blake wrote an amazing poem called The Schoolboy. But to go to school on a summer morn, oh, it drives all joy away. Right? That's what Blake says in that poem. Right? Or surely you will grow double. Up, my friend, clear your looks. Amazing expression in that poem. Tables turn. Clear your looks. Let there be a perception change. Why all this toil and trouble with books? Come into the world of nature. Look at nature. Look at the people connected with nature. Then we obviously at this particular point deconstruct. I mean, in Wordsworthian context, mildly, that's why I use the word mildly, deconstruct all knowledge systems existing at that particular time. For Wordsworth, nature was manifold, multiple, but at the same time had an amazing unity. Next slide, please. Now, the next two slides will deal with the two movements connected with our talk, Transcendentalism and, say, Romanticism. Now, one of the important things that we see in the context of Transcendentalism is, as Emerson himself said, that you need a change. Right? He wrote in a poem, he wrote in a text, all mean egotism vanishes. And he says, I become a transparent eyeball. We have been dealing with perception, a way of seeing things. And the way of seeing things is a way of doing things. Right? So he says, it becomes a transparent eyeball. I see all universal beings circulate through men. I am a part or particle of God. Right? So this is the most important, say, connect that, say, Emerson had with the world around him. Right? He lost his first wife, whom he loved. She died of tuberculosis. Then he took to a European tour. He went to a park, let's say a zoological and botanical park in France, where he says that he underwent a great change. He says, I am moved by strange sympathies. Right? I am moved by strange sympathies. And then he obviously came to England. He met Wordsworth and Coleridge. And like I told you, let's say he actually considered Coleridge and Wordsworth to be a bit ordinary, conservative. And he considered both of them to be a bit ordinary and conservative. Now, what are the belief systems? Quickly, we'll go through this. A divine spirit in nature and every living soul. Emerson constantly spoke about, say, conditioning and deconditioning. Right? History is an impertinence and an injury, he said. History is an impertinence and an injury. So what is most important is believing in the oversoul, believing that there is divinity in every single thing around us. There was this most important emphasis on what you call the value of the ordinary. And transcendental, say from Kant, obviously, transcendental idea said that all knowledge is concerned with ways of knowing objects, not with objects. We will never know objects as they are unless you intuitively learn about them. Reason can never take you there. Right? You have so many poems, say, describing the beauty of water, that chemistry can tell, say it's H2O, for example. That's also a description. This is also a description. This you may say it's emotional, that it's scientific, reason-based. But both experiences are extremely important to us. So in that particular context, all knowledge is transcendental, he said. Right? And both Romanticism and Transcendentalism firmly believed in the power of intuition and imagination. Right? And they can believe in their own authority if everything in them is intuitive and instinctive. Again, major concern of D.H. Lawrence in the poem Snake. An intuitive, instinctive grasp of the world. That's what Lawrence wanted, not reason. The voice of accursed education. Right? Reason for him, let's say, is accursed. But what is even more important is that transcendentalism, American transcendentalism, had very progressive strands because it took very firm stand on women's rights, abolition of, say, of slavery, reform, education, and they obviously were subversive, to use a modern term. Right? The creeping industrialization, it had just come, it's just arrived. Right? Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Hopkins later would say, all is seared with the trade, bleared and smeared with toil. Generations have trod. So it is very proactive, transcendentalism. American transcendentalism has hugely impacted these things. And more importantly, Emerson created a state of mind. Now, he was the first one to declare an intellectual declaration of independence in America when he said no to transatlantic European influences. He says, I don't want the European views anymore. That made, say, Walt Whitman exult and say, I was simmering and simmering and simmering. Emerson brought me to a boil. Right? The first thing that he did is to be self-reliant. America to be self-reliant. That's at the political level, at the social level, at the literary level. At the personal level, self-reliance would mean a complete belief in intuition and instinctive appraisal of life. So he gave them a state of mind in which imagination was better than reason. But the last one is important. Action was better than contemplation. But don't forget, without contemplation, there can be no action. Contemplation is very important. But mere contemplation is useless. That lead to a kind of armchair criticism. Contemplation should lead to action. Right? You need to introspect. You need to contemplate. Valluvur says, "Enni tuniga karmam tuninda bin ennuvom enbadu." Right? Action is important in the context of contemplation. And most importantly, they all believe, all transcendentalists believe, human beings in whichever century we live can transcend limits and reach astonishing heights. Now we saw them, saw those people during the Chennai floods. We see them now during this pandemic. They have reached terrific spiritual heights. Dr. Rufus gave a lot of examples in his lecture. Right? All those doctors, nurses, I think it's Dr. Abdul also mentioned yesterday. Amazing contribution, primarily because they have transcended their limits and reached astonishing heights. So their life itself, in one sense, becomes what you will call a praxis of transcendental literature. Right? So this is the time that we need to understand that all of us, right? All of us, as Thoreau said, insist on yourself, never imitate. Going back to the word conditioning. Right? Going back to the word conditioning. So in that particular context, let's say the romantic and transcendental movements, they deal with this important idea of action. Next slide, please. Now, when you look at the features of English Romanticism, you have that famous Jacques Rousseau's declaration, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Right? And Emerson said, individual is a god in ruins. Right? Man is free and everywhere he is in chains. Romantic literature also challenged the establishment. And what they had, very interestingly, is a desire for liberty. Now, the word establishment will refer to the political setup, social setup. But don't forget, the word establishment also can mean or also include our modes of thinking, our conditioned modes of thinking. And obviously, they denounce the exploitation of the poor, which is it will be a continual concern of humanity. Not now, not earlier. Say every historical phase will obviously denounce the exploitation of the poor. And they firmly believe in imagination providing them with insights, perception. Now, this unitedness, this connectedness cannot happen through reason. You can only have multiverse through reason. You can have universe through imagination. Universe becomes possible only through imagination. So you can transcend that way. So they indulged in their creative exercises, which illuminated and transformed the world into a coherent vision. 1800 to 1850 is normally that's a time frame that we give for romanticism. 1830 to 1840, when you take American, transcendentalism into consideration. Now, among these poets who strove for, self-expression, emotional intensity, personal freedom, and social concern, Blake is preeminent. He was very radical in his political views, and he was mostly concerned with social justice. You take his poem London, to take the other poems that he has written, so it's the chimney sweeper poems, right? The songs of innocence, songs of experience. Even in his mystical poems, he obviously alludes to this idea of social injustice meted out to certain people of society. And Wordsworth, right? We talked about the democratic fervor in romantic literature. He obviously dealt with the marginalized, right? Oppressed by society, the rural poor, where Lucy and others come, discharged soldiers from army, right? Fallen women, and so on. Right? But as I told you, today's criticism is that Wordsworth was not as proactive as some of the American transcendentalists were. Now, Byron is an important person. We know, revolution, very interestingly, in the romantic context, French Revolution of 1789 is a huge source of inspiration for romantic literature. Though 1798, the publication of lyrical ballads begins romantic movement. Right? So revolution was in the air. Revolution became an idea. Revolution became an ideal in these people's poetry. Right? For Wordsworth and Coleridge, it was an event, let's say. And for Coleridge and for Shelley and Byron, they were ideas. Revolution was in the air, as it were. That's why we have labels calling Shelley a revolutionary idealist and Byron a revolutionary iconoclast. Now, Byron is a very important person because, as I told you, he was for pro-action. That's why he participated in the struggles for Italian nationalism, and he fought a war in Greece. Right? It had nothing to do with it. He wanted to free Greece from Ottoman's rule. Right? The liberation of Greece from Ottoman's rule. Now, that was his commitment. Right? And it was Byron who, even in his own time, condemned Wordsworth as being a man of the establishment. Right? And I told you, Emerson thought that Wordsworth was a bit conservative. And these are opinions, let's say. Right? These are opinions about that man. Now we take the last part. Just the few lines that I would like to comment on. Right? First one is, the next slide, please. The first poem is from Blake's poem, A Little Boy. A few lines from Blake's poem. Right? Now, I told you that this is a poem which dealt with slavery when slavery was legal, let's say, right? 1789, the French Revolution happened, right? Wordsworth was talking about, Blake was talking about, slavery, and then uses a beautiful metaphor. I'll read the previous lines. For when our souls have learned the heat to bear, the cloud will vanish, we will hear his voice, saying, come out of thy grove, my love and care, and rejoice round my golden tent. That's how God tells. And what is a cloud metaphor? Cloud becomes a metaphor for the human body, but it doesn't stop there. Cloud becomes a kind of a symbol for demeaning social constructs which define a human body in terms of this or that. Right? So Blake was so against this social inequality. So his mother tells him, mother tells the little boy, and he tells the English boy what his mother told him. Thus I say to the little English boy, when I from black and he from white cloud free. Beautiful. Right? It's just a complexion. It's just the pigmentation of the skin. Right? You understand that huge constructs, racial, caste, so many things that have happened in this world. So in that context, the human body, which is a human body, white boy, black boy, doesn't matter. but they have heaped constructs on the human body, which Wordsworth will call, Blake will call a dark cloud. Right? He'll call it a dark cloud. So I told the English boy, then I from black and he from white cloud free, and round the tent of God like lambs we joy. Right? Amazing poem, which deals with the idea of giving up constructs, giving up conditioning. The next poem, let's say, which was written in 1750, right? This was actually written for the death of his friend Richard West in 1742. Stanzas written in country churchyard. Then it became elegy written in the country churchyard. He handed over this poem to his friend Horace Walpole, who was a Whig politician who believed in constitutional monarchy, right? Who believed in parliamentary democracy. But very interestingly, this poem is an amazing poem because it dealt with the common. It privileged the common, right? It made us see life in the common, though during his time, this elegy was merely seen as a meditation on death, right? A meditation on death. In other words, during his time, the political ramifications of this poem were never foregrounded. But when you look at it today, elegy is such an important poem because it was that which it is almost paved way for Wordsworth's Lucy poems, Old Cumberland Beggar and other poems that I mentioned earlier. And the third poem is by Wordsworth, 1797, where he talks about both, say, urbanization and about a poor girl who had actually moved from the village to the city, right? Reverie of poor Susan. Her heart is in heaven, but they fade. Because now the sights and sounds that she comes across in the city, ultimately become, right? Ultimately become a problem for her because it reminds her of her life in the country. Right? The sights and sounds remind her of her life in the country. The mist and the river, the hill, let's say, and the shade, the stream will not flow for her. The hill will not rise for her because in an urbanized society, in an exploitative, commercial, commodifying society, Susan has become a pawn and the colors have all passed away from her eyes. And the last poem is from Skylark, right? Shelley's poems are 1820. Very interestingly, let's say he also meditated on the still sad music of humanity. We look before and after and pine for what is not. With some pain is fraught our sweetest songs that tell us of saddest thought. Right? And after having said that, he actually appeals to the nightingale. All of them wrote odes. They always wanted to draw inspiration from the objects outside because they never saw them as objects outside. They actually saw them as a projection of their own consciousness. So teach me but half the gladness, that thy brain must know such harmonious madness from my lips would flow. The world should listen as I am listening now. Now, this is the job of the poet. You know that the famous statement he made, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. So he listens to the Skylark and he will listen to that song and transfer that knowledge to us. Provide us with that insight as well. Right? So when you look at this movement, you say it was inspired by an evening walk when he was in Livorno, Italy. So you take these poems, these are only representatives. I've not taken all the poems of the Romantic age. So what is most important is that these people have constantly been inspiring people. Right? When you go to American literature, beat movement, the beat poetry obviously had transcendental connections. Ginsberg was inspired by Blake. Right? He was inspired by Emerson. Though their mode of expression was different from that of, or for those of Emerson and Thoreau, they connected themselves with that particular thought that you need to question, you need to ask, you need to decondition your mind and heart constantly. And then beat poetry today, you refer to Gary Snyder, amazing eco-philosopher and poet who continues the tradition. Again, it goes back to Emerson. So in one sense, you can say, when you look at literature of transcendence as literature of, say, of liberation or literature of eco-philosophy, then transcendentalism and English romanticism have always inspired these poets. Say, when you take these generations of poets into consideration. Now, I'd like to conclude with an amazing quote from Martin Luther King, which is in keeping with what Einstein said the first slide. All life is interrelated. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. And then he makes an amazing statement. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Now you have a quantum physicist turned environmentalist, Fritjof Capra, speaking about the same thing. You see a quantum physicist, Einstein, speaking about the same thing. And you see a political philosopher like Martin Luther speaking about the same thing. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. The web of life, as we called it, tied to a single garment of destiny. I think this holds good for all of us now in this world. Right? We are all tied to or tied into a single garment of destiny. Then he makes an important statement. Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. Right? Whatever affects one indirectly affects all indirectly. That's primarily because we are interrelated and we are caught. Beautiful word. Right? Caught not in a negative sense. Right? We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. So let us believe in this network of mutuality. Let us believe that what happens to others, let's say, is actually happening to us. And only then it is possible for us to give up this idea of selfishness and not only live a life of transcendence, but produce a literature of transcendence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for taking us to American transcendentalism, romantic literature, and relating it to deep ecology. I think the takeaway for all of us was that all life is interrelated. We have to be responsible Anthropocenes. And thank you for bringing to us the importance of coexistence, respect for all forms of life, and probably correcting our notions about spirituality. So thank you for that. And now I invite the participants to ask questions if you have any.
Sir, I have a question, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Sir, in your presentation, you have mentioned about Ani Nays, who talks about deep ecology in detail. In what way it is connected with transcendentalism, sir?
Yeah, see, when transcendentalism believed in divinity in everything, right, a divine spark in everything, and believed in an interconnected whole, the deep ecological perception obviously is in keeping with what Emerson and Thoreau had taught. I'm not saying they inspired him, they could have inspired Arne. Now, he did distinguish deep ecology from shallow ecology. Shallow ecology leads to consumerism and, say, dilettantism. Whereas deep ecology for him is that belief that, right, every life form has a significance, has a meaning, has an intrinsic value, as I told you. So in that connection, let's say you see that Emerson also thought like that. Thoreau also thought like that. And Wordsworth, obviously, when he dealt with common people, common things in nature. And even a blade of grass becomes beautiful when Wordsworth describes it. Now, for us, it's just a matter of fact experience. Wordsworth and Charles Lamb obviously look for the beauty in the commonplace. And so did Emerson, so did Thoreau, and so did Arne. So in that connection, deep ecology is connected with transcendentalism because they believed in this divine spark in everything around them. And the recognition of the divine spark is the most meaningful living.
Is it not biocentric point of view, sir?
No, it is not biocentric. Biocentric would only mean, let's say, life around us when you take organisms into consideration. Arne cannot be called merely biocentric. It begins with biocentric. It begins with biology and, let's say, ends with ecology. That's why I said biocentrism to ecocentrism. Right now, it's become one single unit. It's become one single unit. You don't say separate biocentrism from ecocentrism today. right? As all life forms in nature are important, all life forms in the human world, let's say, are also extremely important. It's not completely biocentric. It began, yes, definitely it began because it was a meditation on the natural world and the Anthropocene, the human impact on the natural world. So that's how it began. But deep ecology obviously led to that's why I used the word environment in a very broad-based sense and said that it includes humanity and all the problems.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you for the explanations.
Good morning, sir.
Yes,
Hello, I'm audible.
you
Good
are
morning,
audible.
sir.
Good morning.
Yes, and thank you for a very, very enlightening and engaging session. Really, you transported us to the world of transcendentalism. I am Dr. Seema Sarkar, Associate Professor in English from Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh.
Yeah,
So, I have a very, I mean, you know, when you have presented that slide of ego and nature, I really was imagining about Blake's lamb and tiger. Then Wordsworth's that the world is too much with us always inspires me. I so often I quote it because that is very timely and that tells us that yes, we are away from nature and we should be like that. Your transcendentalism, but I think Srimad Bhagavad Gita is also a very, very important text that leads towards transcendentalism, that is from soul to super soul. And a very humble query of mine is that, you know, Shakespeare's sonnet is there where he's saying, love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. So I think this is also somewhere, some way a shade of transcendentalism, that is time is very powerful and eternity of death. And so of course it is somewhere shade. Of course he's not a romantic in the romantic poet, but still the shade of thing is there. I think if you can tell me that I'm right or wrong.
Yeah, see, the idea is, see, when I use the word literature of transcendence in the way that we have looked at it today, right, you can include a host of writers.
Thank you.
See, when you take specific time frames, you take English Romanticism and American Transcendentalism. Right? Now, Coleridge made that famous statement, he prayed best who worshipeth best all things both great and small.
Yeah.
Right? Amazing statement he made. It's a huge transcendental statement. And if you take Shakespeare and other writers, obviously they had meditated on this meaningful connect. Right? In all his comedies, there is a meaning, particularly a play like As You Like It has an amazing, say, meaningful connect, where he talks about sermons and stones and see good in everything. And at the same time, using Jacques and other characters, he also speaks about the exploitation of nature. So all these people, let's say, see, world over.
Yeah, the world is a stage.
Yes,
Sorry,
the
world is a stage, and of course.
Yeah, all literatures in the world will have this transcendental streak. If you understand transcendentalism as looking for a meaningful connect among all the things in this cosmos.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Hi.
Hello, sir. This is Rashika.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, sir. You haven't mentioned much about John Keats. So can you, if so, how would you place him under the light of your discussion on transcendence?
Yeah, good question. Thank you very much. See, the main idea is, we were talking about, say, people with regard to the idea of environmental activism. Now, we know among the younger generation of romantic poets, comprising Keats, Byron, and Shelley, the one poet, let's say, who completely disassociated himself from all the things that are happening outside him was John Keats. Right? He created an amazing world of beauty. That famous poem, Endymion, I love to say, thing of beauty is a joy forever. And he lost himself in the nightingale, he lost himself in nature, though he had to come back, let's say, come back to this particular world of pain and misery and so on. But when you talk about proaction, when you look at his letters, when you look at the poems that he has written, there is no revolutionary zeal that you see in Shelley, Byron, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. And that's the main reason why I didn't include Keats in this discussion. He's a great romantic poet, right? An amazing poet, let's say, who responded to the beauties of nature. He also does, obviously, speak about the significant small aspects of nature in his poems. The Grasshopper and the Green is an amazing poem that he has written. But I excluded Keats from this discussion primarily because I began with the idea that it's not a literature of escapism, but a literature of proaction. That is the main reason why I didn't say meditate on Keats in our discussion. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, sir.
Any other question? We can take one maybe.
Sir?
Yeah, yes, Dr.
Sir, is transcendentalism only related to poetry, or is
No,
there
no.
or is there any novels which speaks
Lots of. See, you take Melville's novels. See, transcendentalism is more. See, I don't even want to use the word conceptual framework because they all believe that transcendentalism is a matter of experience, right? Whether Whitman wrote a poem or Melville wrote a novel, right? Emerson did not write much of poetry, right? As many essays that he has written, actually. Right? Thoreau did not write as many poems as other poets, let's say, have written in the transcendental movement. So it definitely doesn't belong to any one literary form of poetry or drama or fiction and so on. So transcendentalism, obviously, as I told you, this will be the music and Indian musical term, it will be the Shruti of all writings which commit themselves to the idea of the well-being of humanity through this broadening vision, or to give up that optical delusion of consciousness. It is definitely not poetry alone. It's definitely not poetry alone.
Thank you for making it clear, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure. Pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Professor Ganesh. Thank you, participants. We had a very lively, uplifting session today. And the bottom line for me, or from Sir's lectures, all knowledge is transcendent. So I think we can explore a lot. So you can see transcendence in Shakespeare and many literary texts spanning across ages. So I also thank Sir for signposting us and directing us to realize that transcendence is not escape from reality, but it's a lot more to do with proaction. We need to keep that balance. And connected well with what our earlier speakers have spoken, Dr. Jinnah, about pragmatism, and the connect between Dr. Jinnah's lecture and Dr. Ganesh's lecture was introspection. That was a key word that came across both lectures. And Dr. Rufus took us through 3 axes: reality, identity, and time. And interestingly, though he spoke about existentialism, the bottom line there was celebrate who you are and live in the moment. So I thank Dr. Ganesh, and I thank these 3 like-minded speakers who have addressed us these 3 days. We look forward to Dr. Bennett's lecture tomorrow. And so, dear friends, we will meet tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Maria Priti, for this amazing opportunity to meet people. And I also wish to place on record my indebtedness to Dr. Jinnah's lecture yesterday, Abdul Jinnah's lecture yesterday, and the previous one. As you rightly said, let's say Dr. Rufus, Dr. Abdul Jinnah, and this thing has a lot of meaningful connect. So I thank both of them for their immense contribution to this particular seminar. And this connect is actually making it even more interesting. And so I said, and I also thank Dr. Samuel Rufus for his amazing support. He has been a lifelong friend of mine, and thank him for all the supports, let's say emotional and technological. Right. So Dr. Rufus, thank you very much. And Queen Mary's, thank you very much for this amazing opportunity. God bless you all.